Thank you everyone for joining us this morning on this beautiful sunny Saturday. That everyone is really excited to see that new spring growth pushing on all of our perennials and our deciduous fruit trees and shrubs. It's really fun. We are going to go through slides for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to leave time for your questions at the end. However, as Dan mentioned, please enter questions as they come up in the Q&A. If they are quick and easy answers, I will answer the questions as we go. I will also save some for Charlotte to answer at the end. We're going to talk a little bit about what the Our Water, Our World program is for those of you that are not as familiar with it. And I'm also going to provide a brief introduction to integrated pest management and how that is related to vermiculture. And then Charlotte's going to dive into why composting is important and the benefits of vermiculture. We're going to talk about how to set up and maintain your system, harvesting and using earthworm castings, or actually, they're not earthworm castings, they're red wigglers. And then troubleshooting and some resources that we have for you. So let's get started. So the Our Water, Our World program, for those of you that are not as familiar with it, is a program that's designed to bring awareness between pesticides and water quality. And we partner with retailers that sell pesticides, such as the Sloat Garden Centers. And we are sponsored by municipalities or water pollution prevention agencies. And we provide integrated pest management education. And so what we do here is help folks like you grow healthy gardens in a sustainable way and solve your pest problems in ways that will not pollute the waterways, but then is also healthier for the environment and the habitat that surrounds us. You can find information about the Our Water, Our World program at ourwaterourworld.org. And next time you're in the Sloat Garden Center, stop by the literature rack to pick up a fact sheet on some pest management problem solving for aphids, or how to grow healthy roses, how to grow healthy gardens, and other topics, or scan the QR codes at your local stores. And with that, Charlotte, I forgot. Okay, my gosh. Integrated pest management. Sorry. Integrated pest management. I talk about this all the time. I almost forgot to mention it. I like to see integrated pest management more as like common sense pest management. It is nothing fancy. It's really just helps us identify the problem and solve that problem. And we take a lot of we do a lot of practices that will help prevent pest problems. But integrated pest management allows us to look at the system as a whole, in this case, the garden. And when something looks a little funny, or maybe it looks like a problem might be occurring, we take a closer look, we get really curious, and we start to identify what is the problem at hand, and then what is the threshold of tolerance that the plant can live with. Because oftentimes that plant can handle a little damage more than we can. We're always going to use science-based strategies to address any problems. And if we need to take some action, the action steps in IPM are called controls, cultural controls, which is increasing the health of that garden, mechanical controls, which are the tools we might use to manage pest problems, such as traps and barriers. Biological controls is inviting beneficial organisms in to help manage those pest problems. And then chemical controls, which are the pesticides, which we're always going to want to use as a last resort, and always going to choose the least toxic, most eco-friendly option available. Today, vermiculture and adding worm castings to our soil is a combination between the biological controls and cultural controls. I personally am adding some worm castings to my garden. Today, I'm going to do some planting. I'm also going to add some worm castings to, around my citrus, around my roses, because I really want to increase the health of that soil, and so much more that Charlotte's going to share with us next. So thank you, Charlotte. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Suzanne and Dan, for that introduction. I love composting, I love soil, I love worms, so I'm really excited to be here today talking about all of those things. So I just wanted to start with why should we be composting? And that includes vermicompost and other kinds of compost, which I'll touch on briefly, but won't go into depth about. Well, the reason is because we create a lot of waste in the United States and in the world. And a lot of that waste is organic waste. About a third in the United States, about a third of all waste is food or organic waste. And when it goes to the landfill, say in a plastic bag like pictured here, it doesn't decompose, it doesn't break down, it doesn't add anything to the environment. It actually adds methane to the environment, so when it breaks down without air, it creates methane, and it adds methane to the atmosphere, which is significantly more potent actually than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. I've heard anywhere between 20 and 70 times more potent. So definitely very important to keep the methane out of the atmosphere. And how we can do that is by not putting our organic waste in the landfill where it doesn't get broken down properly, and making sure it does get broken down properly with composting. And a few other facts about organic waste. According to Project Drawdown, the food we waste is responsible for roughly 8% of global emissions. And when we talk about food waste or organic waste, it's not just the food that's going into the landfill. It's also all the things that went into creating that product. So the land, the water, the labor, the fertilizer that was used to produce the product, but then also the energy spent on processing, transporting, preparing, storing, packaging, and then disposing of that food. So there's a lot of energy just beyond that banana peel that goes into it when we throw it away. So to reduce that organic waste, there's a few things we can do. Now, the best thing we can do is to not produce our waste. Obviously, that's not always possible. We do always have banana peels, but source reduction is the best thing we can do. So not overbuying, eating our leftovers, making sure we're aware of what's in the refrigerator, really just reducing that excess waste in the first place is going to be the best thing to do. Then the next best thing would be to, if it's possible, feed hungry people. Maybe there's a donation that you can contribute to. There are a lot of hungry people out there, so getting the food to those people that need it. And then after that, maybe feeding food to livestock. Obviously, we don't all we live in the Bay Area. It's probably unusual that we'd have a pig in our backyard. But maybe we have chickens, maybe we can donate to a neighbor that has some sort of critter that will eat some of our food scraps. Then after that, then the next step would be home composting. So when we compost at home, it's the shortest distance from where the food waste was produced to where it's going to be composted. We don't need to truck it anywhere. We don't need It's unlikely that we don't need any equipment to move our home composting, and then we can use those food waste resources back in our garden. So that's keeping it at home, keeping that compost close to home is going to be the best option if we are going to choose to compost our material. That's not to say that we shouldn't be using our green bins. If you have municipal compost and that is all you have available to you, absolutely, we should be using those systems because they're fantastic. They're providing more composting to more people, which is great. But if you do have the space to do a little bit of composting at home, and worm composting, what we'll talk about today, is very small, very easy, that will just keep some of those resources closer to home and less reliant on that big industrial scale composting. All right, so what is vermiculture? Vermiculture is the cultivation of earthworms with the purpose of using them to convert organic waste into fertilizer. And now learned about a couple of worm farms in this research for this program. Some people do vermiculture to raise worms for either fishing or to selling for other compost operations. And some people do vermiculture for the castings, and then some, of course, do it for both. If you're doing it at home, it's likely to convert your waste into fertilizer for your plants and then get that fertilizer into your garden. Now, what isn't usually said very clearly because we use words like castings, what we're really doing is we are collecting worm poop. We want their waste, their poop, because that is chock full of microbes and has processed our food in a way that's available for plants. And that's what we're doing. We're raising the worms so that they eat and they poop and we collect their poop. But I will call it castings because that's what it's called generally. And then just a note between what vermicompost versus earthworm castings are. You might see different labels if you are buying a product. Vermicompost is usually castings and composted material, organic material mixed together. So it might not be full, it's not 100% castings. It still has some organic material like maybe woody material or food scraps broken down or some bedding left over. Whereas if you see earthworm castings, that is pure earthworm castings. It's everything in the bin has been eaten and all that's left is the poop. One is not better than the other necessarily. It's just, I just wanted to clarify the labeling. And then also something should touch on is what's the difference between vermiculture or worm composting versus just other composting. Isn't it all worms? No, it's not all worms. When we send, for example, when we send our material in the green bin to the, like Recology, for example, in San Francisco, they take it away to an industrial facility. What they're doing is hot composting, aerobic composting, where they're encouraging the bacterial life, microbial life, fungal matter to break down the material. Sure, there might be some worms in there, but they're usually on the outskirts because in hot composting, it's all about the bacterial activity and the fungal activity. And then the same in your backyard. If you have a backyard bin, whether it's hot, cold, somewhere in the middle, there probably are some worms in it, but they're not doing the most of the work. What you're likely relying on is again, that the microbes, bacteria, the fungus, and the invertebrates. So and then in vermiculture, it's really focusing on just the worms and getting those worms to be happy and eating a lot and pooping a lot. That's what we want. So why is vermicompost or worm castings really so wonderful, and why should we be using them in our garden? They provide nutrients to plants in a plant available form. So when we put organic material like fertilizer or leaves into the soil or on top of the soil, plants aren't able to take nutrients from that fertilizer or other organic material in the soil on their own. They need microbes, bacteria, fungus and vertebrates to process that organic material and feed it to the plants in a form that the plants can take up. And so also that's what the worms are doing. They're eating that organic material, pooping it out, and that the nutrients are available to the plants. Worm castings are really nutrient dense, so we actually don't need as much in the garden. We can use less. Just, a small amount in a planting hole can really add a lot of nutrients to the garden or to that plant. It can protect seedlings from bacteria. So it's a really common thing to mix into a seedling mix, because it really helps that seed be protected from any diseases that might be in the seedling mix or the potting mix. Vermicompost or worm castings can boost plant immunity to pests and disease. it like, I don't know, it like might strengthen the cell walls. I'm not exactly sure how it does it, but it boosts the immunity so it can fight off pests and disease if they are in the soil or in the air. It adds microbial and fungal activity to the soil. It improves soil structure. So it adds these like sticky proteins to the soil so that your sandy soil can be glued together and hold water better. But then also it can glue together clay soil so that it has better structure and more aeration. Also moving through the soil, those worms are creating tunnels and burrows and adding aeration and better drainage to the soil. It also, studies actually from several universities have shown that adding worm castings or vermicompost to the soil can improve plant growth in size, bloom, and quality, and even taste. So always a great thing to add, even if you're adding other compost, always you should add into those that mix the earthworm castings as well. And just, as I mentioned before, it creates a closed loop system. We're using resources that we are either creating in our yard with our yard waste or with our veggie waste, and then putting it back into the soil to keep moving those resources around and around. So just a quick introduction to worm bin systems. They can be bought at a store. I think the Sloat Gardens carries the Worm Cafe or the Can O' Worms, which actually the Can O' Worms is pictured in this photo. That's my worm bin. Or you can make your own. DIY worm bins are they can be very simple or they can be very complicated if you want it to be. I've seen worm bins as benches, as side tables, as parts of furniture, or just very elaborate. So you can get kind of crazy with it as long as the conditions are met. Worm bins are pretty small. Mine pictured right there is maybe 3 feet tall and probably, takes up 2 by 2 or 2 to 3 feet by, around. They can be, yeah, pretty small, just kind of a small bin. They can be stored inside or outside. Bay Area climates are fantastic for outdoor worm bins because it never gets too cold. We don't want them to freeze. It does get quite hot here in the Bay Area, or at least not where I live in San Francisco, but elsewhere. So you do want to protect it from the extreme heat, but generally the Bay Area climate is pretty good for worm bins. For worms, we are going to use raw vegan food scraps plus eggshells. I'll get more into that later. It really requires very little effort. We'll talk about setting up the worm bin, how to maintain it, but you can leave, these are going to be the easiest pets you've ever had. You can leave for 2 months on a vacation and the worms should be fine as long as the general conditions, especially the temperature and moisture, are met. And you can have usable vermicompost in, I say 3 to 6 months, but it's probably closer to like 6 months, depending on, how much you're feeding, how many worms you have, what are the conditions. And it's great for kids. They really love poking around in there and saying hi to the worms. Again, great pets, very easy pets, fun for the whole family. So let's look at some options for worm bins. As I said, they can be small, big, fancy, simple. The one on the top left is just a like kind of a Rubbermaid bin that is, great for making your own. There's layered bins that you can buy. As I said, the Can O' Worms or the Worm Cafe. You can get a fancy wooden one. The one on the bottom left is made by my friend who's Common Compost. She makes these in more like industrial kind of flow through worm bins for schools and like 4-H clubs, places that produce a lot of food scraps. And then you can go real big, probably not, we probably won't be doing this, but that picture is actually of the Sonoma worm farm. Big trays, long trays in big houses that can house like millions of worms at a time. So again, they can be small, simple, big, complicated, but we'll go for the simple ones today. And I just wanted to point out, if you're making it your own worm bin, I do recommend choosing a dark color. This one is lighter, but it usually is stored underneath a bench and like in a kind of a dark space, so that's not a problem. But usually a dark blue or black would be good just to protect the worms from light. And then of course we want to make sure that they have air. We're not sealing them in with no air. So you can you're going to have to poke some holes, drill some holes into this bin to add some aeration. So you can see those small holes. There's some on the top and then there's some more on the bottom. Personally, I feel like the ones on the bottom are a little bit too low, just because I feel like worms could get out and you'd have to keep the bedding pretty low, but it seems to be working for this worm bin. But anyway, making sure they have enough air getting in, but not too much light. So which worms are we going to use? We're going to use Eisenia fetida, which are called red worms or red wigglers. They're called epigeic worms. They're surface dwelling, so they're usually just in like the top couple of inches on the forest floor, eating leaves or eating manure, eating that. Mostly they're just in the organic matter and less deep down into the soil. But these are going to be the best suited for a worm bin because they eat quickly. They like, again, they only need a few inches deep of material, and they kind of suit our conditions. There are some other worms that you can use if you live more in like Southern California or in the southern part of the country where the temperatures are warmer. There are other worms that can handle warmer temperatures, but I would say most people use this kind of worm. Some fun facts about them: they have 5 hearts. They do not have any lungs. They breathe through their skin, and their skin needs to be moist. They can't be like underwater, but they do need to have some moisture to keep their skin moist. And they all have both male and female reproductive organs, but they do require a partner to reproduce. So how to create a habitat for these red wigglers? What do they need? Darkness, as I mentioned, so a sealed, like dark container. Moisture, not too much moisture. If they're flooded, they're gonna not be able to get any oxygen. So just moist, like cakey. Well, I'd say a little bit more than a cake, kind of a lightly wrung out sponge, maybe we would say, for the moisture. They do need air, airflow and oxygen that will help with keeping moisture levels correct and also giving them some oxygen. They will need food, which we'll talk about in a moment. It is good to add bedding too. They need some sort of carbon material, which usually can be shredded newspaper, coconut coir, or, shredded leaves, dried up leaves can be good for that as well. And the temperatures for the red wigglers, the optimal temperatures are 40 to 80 degrees. So trying to keep them out of super cold freezing temperatures and keeping them away from the super hot times of the summer as well. And you can store them both inside and outside. I will say inside if you are having them inside. I know several people who have them inside. It just requires a little bit more attention just because we don't want to attract too many pests, and we'll talk about that later. But it's great because, you're chopping up your veggies for your salad. All the food scraps can just be tossed right into the worm bin because it's under the sink or under the cabinet right where you're working. So it can be really convenient. And you can also, if you don't have a lot of outdoor space, they're great for, you can put them in a garage, you can put them on a balcony. They don't take up much space, so you can be flexible even if you don't have a backyard. If you do have a backyard and you want to put them outside, in the warm temperatures, they should be kept in the shade or on the north side of the building so that they don't get too hot. And then, of course, you can move them as the seasons change. If you get close to freezing temperatures, you want to maybe either put them on a, maybe not in the hot sun, but you want to keep them up against a building or in the garage to keep the temperatures a little bit more moderate. And now what to feed them. I recommend starting with raw fruit and veggie scraps, just that raw, uncooked stuff, the fruit and veggies, plant material. They do like used coffee grounds. And we do recommend eggshells as well because they require a bit of grit or like mineral material to process food. They don't have teeth. So what they do is they kind of suck the stuff in, and in their digestive tract, they will have that like eggshell bits or other kind of mineral bits to kind of help chew and break down that material. Um, so you can use eggshells. I like to crush up the eggshells, or you can, if you don't want to use eggshells, you can put like a little bit of soil or sand in there as well, and that can help with that as well. I do recommend avoiding citrus or alliums, which would be like onion, garlic, chives, leek. Those have some oils in them that can be toxic or harmful to worms. Uh, Keep in mind how much you're giving them, especially when we start out. Worms, the red wigglers, can eat up to half their body weight in a day, but it's definitely closer to a third or less of their, or 20, a quarter or a third of their body weight in a day. So to think about that, maybe before you get the worm bin or before you start feeding them, weigh how much, food scraps you have in a week. And that will help you understand how many worms you might need. 1 pound of worms is about 1,000 worms. So they'll eat up to a half a pound of food a day. So that's like 3.5 pounds of food a week. So for a big family, creates a lot of waste. You might need to get more worms, or just start small is usually what my recommendation is. Don't give them all of your food scraps, just kind of start small and add as the populations increase. You can also use leaves and yard waste, but especially as like bedding, like those dry leaves, you do want to make sure you're not adding any potential pests or disease to the bin. But also the big thing with using yard waste is you don't want to overfill it. So I know yard waste can be a lot, and the worm bins are pretty small, and you don't want to just like fill it with grass clippings, because then that's all they'll have, and they're not going to want to eat just that. So here's just a little bit more about what to use: vegetables, fruit, eggshells crushed up. You can do nutshells. I'd like to avoid putting in like really tough stuff. So if there's like avocado pits, they're not going to eat. I mean, maybe eventually, but it's unlikely they'll eat a pit of an avocado. But even the avocado skin is a bit tough for them. They'll eat it eventually, but it could take a long time. So usually I'll put that either in the green bin or my other compost bin. So kind of being aware, the softer and easier to eat the material, the faster they'll eat it. So if you're putting a lot of like tough things like nutshells, they're not going to eat it very quickly, but that can be helpful. The nutshells can be good for aeration in the bin and adding to their bedding. You can use paper scraps and cardboard. That's a great thing to add that will help with moderating the moisture levels. You can put in houseplants or yard trimmings as well, but again, you want to make sure everything is balanced. Balance is the most important thing. If you only give your worms coffee grounds, they're going to be very crazy and very unhappy, because that's a lot of the same material that has very strong, it's kind of acidic and high nitrogen. So you can add those things, but just make sure it's balanced. Also add fruit and veggies. Also add some paper scraps to balance it out. And again, we're avoiding citrus and onions, and in the onion family, definitely no medication, no animal poop. We're keeping that. We're putting pet waste in the landfill bin, not even in the green bin. And then I don't recommend putting any dairy products or meat, eggs, things like that, except for those eggshells. Um, Now, some like very experienced worm people, worm farmers who have a lot of worms and have been doing it for a long time, they do put in things like bread or cake or like pancakes. But I would only do that, if after you have a really established big population, you understand the conditions of your bin, and you only put in a little bit at a time, because if you dump a bunch of bread, it's gonna get really moldy and invite in a lot of pests, and it's not gonna be a good environment. So always keeping things balanced. You can um, experiment eventually with what you put in there, but I do recommend being very cautious with some of the things on the no list. So how many worms do you need? I do recommend, again, we're going to figure out how much material we create in a week. That can guide us. It is recommended that you start with 1,000 worms, which is about 1 pound, and you can buy at hardware stores. Dan, maybe you can share if you sell them at Sloat. I apologize, no, I don't know if you do. Or you can order them online. Yes, you do sell them at Sloat?
Yes,
Great.
indeed.
Excellent. Yes, and they're usually they're probably like 200 worms. Do you know how many are in a container?
It's at least 200,
Okay,
yes.
great. So yeah, you can buy them at Sloat. And if you want bigger amounts, you might need to go online for that. But the populations will increase quickly in good conditions. So you can start with those 200 worms, absolutely, but you're only feeding them what they can eat in a week or so, and make sure those conditions are optimal. They will reproduce quickly. It's very unclear how quickly they reproduce because again, it's dependent on the conditions, but I think they lay eggs like up to 3 times a year, and they can lay 2 to 20 eggs at a time. So again, it kind of depends. In the cooler temperatures, they're going to be slower reproducing, and then in the more optimal or warmer temperatures, they'll be better. So just keep, start with your small amount, add a little bit of food at a time, see how quickly the food breaks down and how fast they eat it, and then you can add as you go. Okay, and then, so now we're going to talk about setting up our worm bin. And we have a couple of ways to show you this. But the idea is we're going to get the container, we're going to prepare our container, whether it's store-bought or made at home. We're going to start with bedding, and that can be coir, newspaper, cardboard, and we're going to moisten it. We're going to chop up our food. We don't actually have to chop up our food. You can put your food in unchopped, but if the more you chop it up, the faster they eat it. Put that food in the bin, and then we're going to add our worms. These photos actually don't these are my bin, and this isn't setting up a bin. This is kind of adding a new layer. So I have the lower level. I layer it, since it's the lower level, I put cardboard on the bottom just to reduce a lot of material and worms falling through. It's okay if some does, but I just wanted to reduce that. I add some big chunks of food and some worms from the top layer, added it to this. And note, I didn't moisten the cardboard this time, but that's because my worm bin is a little too wet right now after all the rain. So I actually wanted it to dry out a bit on the cardboard. And then I put my original layer, my layer that's kind of, I want to taper off feeding. I put it on top with the sun, in the sun, so that the worms hopefully will migrate down to the new layer. And then I like to cover my top layer, whichever one it is, the feeding layer or the finishing layer. I like to cover that with either newspaper or cardboard as well. And I just want to share, there's like a million, there's like not a million, but there's many ways that you can put together a worm bin. So here's Suzanne's worm bin, her adding a new layer. I don't know if Suzanne wants to come on and share what she did here.
Hi. Yes. So when I create first time or when I'm adding a new layer, I always wrap actually, I start with a layer of cardboard on the bottom, usually like a medium-sized pizza box fits perfect. This is the Worm Cafe, so it's going to be a rectangle as opposed to a circle. And then I will overlap cardboard to almost like you're wrapping a package. It really helps secure the worms, but I mean, they can still move around, but it kind of keeps all the bedding and food waste intact in a way that will reduce critter activity. You know, rodents like to get in, raccoons like to get in. So whatever you can do to avoid those types of critters getting in. And then it's I soak the cardboard, which I've ripped up into about size of my hand. Those are soaking in water with the coconut coir. And then I'm just shredding that newspaper. And then no need to get the newspaper wet anymore, because when you add the coir and the cardboard, you know, there's enough moisture. And then, yeah, add those worms, tuck in a little food. I fold the newspaper up and over, give it a little spritz of water on the top, and good to go.
Awesome. Yeah, there's a few ways to do it. And also, if you have a layered bin, some people say to put the new layer, like the one you want the worms to move to, on the top, because the worms will travel up. Sometimes you put them underneath. It doesn't really matter. The worms will move to where the food and the good conditions are. And then here, hopefully this works. This is thanks, Suzanne, by the way. Thanks for sharing.
You're
This
welcome.
I made a little reel on my Instagram about setting up a new layer in my worm bin. If you want to watch it on my Instagram, it's earth.ally. I would just recommend it because there's a really cute song that goes with it about worms, but I'll just play the video for you with no sound. So we're going to moisten, that's the coconut coir. Let that soak for a little bit. It expands a lot, but again, you can use brown paper bags or newspaper. Sometimes I blend my food scraps. If you blend it, they suck it down real quick. But I don't do that all the time. As being a go-getter this time, I added eggshells and coffee grounds. I spread out the moist bedding. Again, you can put cardboard or newspaper underneath just to keep it in there. Add the food. And then I scooped some worms from my original bin in there, but not all of them. They're going to move on their own. I cover it with coir, and then I'll usually cover it with newspaper and cardboard again. And then that's it. Let them do their thing. They're very self-sufficient. So again, we want to focus on just maintaining the worm bin. It's very easy. But the first, as you have it for the first couple months, you want to be more attentive to it, just so you understand the population growth and how much food you're giving. So monitor, see how fast they're eating things. So you can add food regularly, especially if their food is getting smaller. As I should have mentioned this earlier, and I think Suzanne told me earlier too, like, you can go a long time without feeding the worms. They will eventually, if they run out of food, like food scraps, they'll start eating their bedding. They'll start eating their dead companions. They'll find things to eat. Sometimes they eat the castings over and over again and reprocess them. So it's not great to leave them for months at a time. But, if you have to go on a 3 or 4 week vacation, don't worry. The worms they don't need, weekly food on schedule. They'll be okay. As long as, again, the temperatures are going to stay moderately the same and there's enough moisture to keep them in. And so if you have good, wet food scraps and you're keeping them in moist bedding and preferably covered, they should be good for a while. You will start to see some other critters in the worm bin, whether it's outside or inside. Snails and slugs, I like to pick them out. They're not like so bad for the worm bin, but if you're having them in the garden, we don't really like to encourage snails and slugs in the garden because they could do some damage to your plants. So I pick them out, I throw them in some soapy water, or if you have chickens, feed them to them. Potworms are fine. Those are decomposers. Springtails, awesome. You'll definitely see those. And those are also great decomposers. Other decomposers that you will see and you don't need to worry about, millipedes, black soldier fly larvae, Pill bugs are decomposers. Some people don't like them in the garden. Some people don't care. So it's up to you whether you want to get rid of them or not. Flies are definitely a potential issue, and we'll talk about later in the troubleshooting about how to get rid of flies. They can be a sign that the conditions are not correct, are not great. If you do see centipedes, it is recommended that you kill them because they can sometimes cause harm to the worms. And then definitely if you see these flatworms, or they're called like planarians, predatory planarians, the one on the bottom, definitely kill those. Those can kill all of your worms. They're not common, so don't like be too worried about them, but definitely, you know, when you're feeding, take a look around and see if you see anything weird. And the flatworms, you can't just like cut them to kill them because they'll regrow. So you want to put them into some salty, soapy water. That's the best way to kill them. And then also we're going to look out for the jumping worm. This is an invasive species. Let's see. I don't know if it's going to work. I had a little video here for you. Oops. Okay, it's not gonna work. Sorry. It's if you YouTube jumping worm, you'll see this video and you'll see how they move. They're very, you know, they look kind of like the red wiggler, but when they move, they're very different. Hold on, let's see if I can. It's not gonna work. They
Yeah,
move really erratically and they
yeah,
can
they
jump
kind
around.
of thrash around.
Yeah, they thrash and they can like
Yeah.
jump even like feet in the air. It's crazy. They have been found in Napa and Sonoma counties, so definitely keep an eye out. The problem with these jumping worms are that they're voracious eaters and they'll eat everything in the worm bin, or if they're in the soil, they're going to eat everything in the soil, all the organic material, and they actually change the structure of the soil, and they basically take away all the nutrients from the other earthworms in the soil too. So we don't want them changing the nutrients and the structure of the soil. Oh, so I would say if you do see them, just contain them, put them in a container, report them to your county ag commissioner. Okay, now harvesting castings. There's a few ways to do this. It kind of depends on your bin, depends on how fast you want to do it. But here's some suggestions. There might be other ways that you come up with that work better for you. If you have a layered bin and you're like, okay, this bin is ready. I think I have a lot of castings. It's pretty full. I want these castings in the next month or so for my garden. You're going to stop feeding on that layer and you're just going to set up a new layer and start feeding there. And those worms are eventually going to move. To help them move, you can do what I did in this picture where I just opened up the top, and those worms are going to move down into the lower level because they don't like sunlight. So you can use them, do both of those methods at the same time. If you have a single layer bin, really, you can just start feeding in one area of the bin or one side of the bin, and eventually those worms are going to move. They just move to where the food is. So they'll eventually move over, and then you can harvest the material on the other side of the bin. Other methods are, if you have the time, you can hand pick them out. Maybe the kids will help with this. Just gently pick them out and put them into a new bin or a new layer. Here I just put some castings onto a screen over a bucket on a sunny day, and those worms are going to move down and eventually drop into the bucket, and I'll put them back into the bin. Or another similar way is just mounding the material on some newspaper or on a surface, and have a bright light or sunlight on them. And again, the worms are going to move down away from the sunlight. And so you can just scoop the top layers of the castings off as the worms move down. And then just, again, you'll have a big ball of worms, put them back in your bin. And now using vermicompost, you can use it similar to any other compost, but you don't need to use as much. So you're going to add it to garden beds and pots. You can put a handful or like a cup of worm castings into a planting hole if you're planting a new plant. You can mix it into the soil in a new bed. You can add it to the soil surface and water it in. And you can use them both indoor and outdoor plants for sure. It's also great to add to a potting mix or a seedling mix. As I mentioned, it can help protect seedlings from diseases. You can also make a compost tea. Let's see here if this works. There might be a little sound there. That's just my compost tea. I put some worm compost into a sock, let it soak in some water, and I have a little aquarium aerator going for about 24 hours, and then I will use it in the garden. We want to aerate it so it doesn't get anaerobic. Keep adding that oxygen to help those microbes keep being active. You can use compost tea as a soil inoculation, a fertilizer, or to spray on the plant leaves as a foliar spray that can help boost immunity sometimes. Compost tea, I will share, can be very simple, but it also can get a little complicated. Some people are, rightly so, very concerned about the water that they use. Rainwater is best because it has no chemicals in it, but of course we're going to run out of rainwater pretty soon if you haven't already. But so you can use there's filters and things that you can add to the water that remove like chlorine and chloramine. There is a filter that is new to Sloat that you can use to take some of those chemicals out of water that will then help. That will be good for compost tea because, sometimes chlorine and other chemicals in the water can kill a lot of the microbes that you want to put into the soil. And another question I've gotten is, well, what if I don't have a garden? I have my worm bin in my kitchen, but I don't have a garden. That's okay. You can trade with friends who do. You can give them some of your worm castings and they can give you some of their flowers or tomatoes or whatever they're growing. So it's always fun to share. Oops. All right, and then we're almost done. We're just going to talk about some troubleshooting. Some common problems. The bin smells. That's usually there's too much food, or the food is too wet, or it's just not getting enough air. And then sometimes the food scraps can be exposed and cause that smell. So there's a few things, of course, you can reduce your feeding. You can cover the food in some bedding, mix in dry bedding, or open up the bin and let some air flow in to dry out some of the food. Similar, if it's attracting flies or other, urban critters like rats, you probably have too much food or the food is exposed. So again, bury the food or chop up the food smaller or just like wait a while for them to eat what they have and then add more. If the worms are dying or crawling away, I have heard a story of someone like having their bin in their kitchen and then waking up to worms everywhere on their kitchen floor. Something was wrong in that bin. The worms were like, I'm out of here. And the bin was not tight, obviously. So if they're dying or they're trying to get out, the conditions aren't right. So we've got to check our moisture, our temperature, our airflow, or our food. It could be the wrong food in there that they don't want to be part of. So again, check all those conditions. And then water collecting on the bottom. This can happen both in a layered bin or a single layer bin. We definitely want to be, if we have a single layer bin, we definitely want to be very conscious of water collecting. If you're adding too many fruits or like just wet food or have too much water in it, we're going to have water on the bottom, which we really don't want in a single layer bin because that can cause the worms to drown. Water, if there is some water in like a layered bin, usually there's a tray at the bottom that collects the water and you can drain it out. I will share the water that comes through and collects into that lower level is not worm tea, and we don't want to use it as worm tea. That water is, or that liquid is leachate, and that can be sometimes anaerobic. So we're not using that on our plants. What I do is if I do have some of it, I will dump it into a bucket, water it down like really really water it down and then put it somewhere in like the back area of my garden where I'm not necessarily putting it on plants. It's not like terrible, but you just have to water it down. Don't use it as worm tea. But again, that can lead to, that can be the cause of poor ventilation, too many watery food scraps. So mix in your dry bedding, let your bin dry out, or hold off on watering or feeding for a while. Some awesome resources. There's amazing resources online I will share, but then this book, Worms Eat My Garbage, is really like a great starter, very easy to read, covers pretty much everything you need to know. The Earth Moved by Amy Stewart. I sent out, hopefully you got a one sheet from Amy Stewart about kind of how to set up the bin as well. I will say The Earth Moved is very much like an ode to the earthworm. It's not really a practical guide, but definitely talks about how awesome they are and the history of them. The Rodale Book of Composting, great if you're interested in any kind of composting. The movie Wasted is all about food waste and ways we can reduce that. And Kiss the Ground is both a book, or it's a book, a movie on Netflix, and it's a website that has a ton of resources and classes that I do recommend if you're excited about composting, soil, climate change, regenerative agriculture, anything like that. And then we have our pest resources, the Our Water, Our World website, the University of California IPM website, the CDFA, the California Department of Food and Agriculture. If you're interested in, if you need to talk to your local county ag commissioner, you're gonna have to Google that number, but just county ag plus your county. Bugguide.net, great for identifying bugs. So if you're poking around in your worm bin and are curious, you could go to bugguide.net. And then the National Pesticide Information Center, really great, easy to read information about common pesticides and the risks that they might have to our environment. And I'm going to end with a quote. Charles Darwin wrote, his last book was all about earthworms. And he was very fascinated with earthworms. So one quote from that book, it may be doubted whether there are many other animals which have played so important a part in the history of the world as these lowly organized creatures. So I hope you all have a little bit more appreciation for the earthworm today and get out in the garden and take a look and see what's out there.
It was so great, Charlotte. I love it. And I hope that all of you are inspired to get out there and start to farm some worms. Some folks have asked, will the resources be available? This recording will be posted on the Sloat website and the Sloat YouTube channel, correct, Dan? Is that right?
That's right. The postings of the videos go up on Tuesdays, so they should both be available then. The slide deck itself will not be available separately, but you can quickly whip through the video and get the slides that way.
Awesome. And we have a question from Susan, and she would like to learn more about keeping rodents and raccoons out of the worm bin. Would you like to take that, Charlotte?
Sure. And you might be able to add some things to that too as well. I have never had problems with rats in my bin, but I will say, actually, no, I haven't had a dog the whole time I've had one. I always like to put like something heavy on top of my bin just to kind of make prying open the lid a little bit harder. Mine is also lifted off the ground, so I know rats can climb it, but they haven't yet. So I guess it would just be being aware of the big chunks of food in there, trying to reduce its smell. I don't know if there's anything else to add, Suzanne.
Yeah, I've had a rat or rats getting into my bin. A couple things to keep in mind, because I have the Worm Cafe and the rectangle one, the sides, there's like you lift up the lid and there's almost like little side flaps that kind of cover where you would the handle. It's hard to describe. But if those little flaps are not taut and secured against the side of the bin, very easy for a rodent to get in, and that was the case. So I just had to make sure I was snugging cardboard even firmer and making sure when I feed, I am really burying the food deep down in the center and like in the bedding, and that it would be less desirable, and not feeding, making sure that the food is all been consumed or mostly consumed before I feed again. As for raccoons, making sure that the lid and the whole bin is bungeed really well, or actually contained in a structure that I built that might be hinged, lattice that's framed, or half-inch hardware cloth that's stapled to frame and hinged, and that would be similar to maybe garbage cans that you would have to secure in a similar fashion. And yeah, that's, I mean, ants is usually an indicator that's too dry, right, Charlotte? But if the ants are a problem, you can also put the feet, each of the legs of the worm bin, into a container with a little bit of soapy water.
Yeah. And ants are really only, I mean, you don't want tons of ants in there for sure, you're taking over, but they're more of a concern if you keep your bin inside. You don't want to attract them inside. So yeah, definitely putting them in some soapy water or just keeping the area clean.
Mhm. Another question that we just received was how best to store finished compost for later use.
I have stored it in a bucket with a sealed lid. I don't like to store it for too long because I want it to keep, you know, I don't want it to like go anaerobic or anything to die out in there. But you can store it. I don't know. Actually, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Suzanne. I'm not like an expert on the storing.
Gosh, I I never have enough to store. I mean, I'm putting a tablespoon into the top couple half inch of the soil of my house plants. I am putting it in around all the plants out in the garden. In fact, I feel like, I mean, use it. I mean, the plants want it. So I would have a hard time storing any, because I feel like I can't even make enough as it is. And I don't have a ton of stuff going on here. But yeah, the house plants love it. I mean, it really adds a lot of vigor and strength. You'll see it within the coming month of growth, actually.
Yeah.
The
But I guess I would, if you want to store it, keep it in, you can put it in a bucket, but I wouldn't probably not like super seal it. Or if you do, just like open it up once in a while to make sure there's a little bit more airflow in there.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
commercially produced worm castings that you can buy at the hardware store, at a Sloat or wherever, are packed in plastic bags like any other potting soil or amendment. And I think probably the biological viability lasts for 6 months or so without any problem. But you don't want to keep it for years, because while you'll get some benefit from just the organic matter, the live bacteria and fungi that live in there that are beneficial, you want to be relatively fresh.
And I would say storing it kind of in a cooler area. You don't want it to get too hot because again, that would degrade the viability.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, fantastic. Have we addressed pretty much all the questions, or let's see, what else do we have here?
Oh, do we need to poke any holes in the bin? That
Mhm.
just came up.
Oh, I saw that one. Only if you're making your own, but the ones that you buy have lots and lots of holes, so don't worry about that. But if you buy like a bin, like a Rubbermaid, you do have to poke several holes in the bin.
And then,
Um,
I'm sorry.
no, go ahead.
Um, there's just one more question, but I'll
Mhm.
let you finish.
No, I'm
Okay,
done.
okay, I'm sorry.
I'm done.
And then Susan's asking, how can you tell when the castings are ready? Is all the food gone completely? I mean, this is a really good question. How do you know?
It's kind of up to you when you're ready to like switch out. Um, it's kind of when you're ready. But yeah, most of the food should be gone and not recognizable or in very, very small parts. But basically you just, so say you have a layered bin, it's full, it's heavy, you know, and you're ready to add to the new one. You're just gonna stop feeding on that full layer, and the worms that are there are going to keep going and break it down even further, but just don't add any more food. And then add food on the lower level. But yeah, when it's ready, it should be mostly unrecognizable pieces, and mostly broken down, no apple cores or anything left.
Yeah. Yeah, usually when the majority of the bin or when there's a good bulk of castings, I'm not adding any more bedding. I've reduced food, and then I'm going to make a new layer and let all the worms come up. And then what's left over is all beautiful, rich castings, and then they're ready to go.